My goal is to, for electricity, what the internet protocol did for communications, help us move to a completely different model for how we do it that is much better than the 19th century model we do today. Yeah, I grew up in Silicon Valley, and so I watched internet technology being born. I had very early experiences with both computers and networking. And that was certainly inspiring this to see that we could actually make huge technological process. And since I've been involved in energy for over 40 years now, I've seen how electricity technology has evolved very little and very slowly by comparison. And I think we can do much better. And I think that the technologies we need to do much better already have been invented. We don't need to invent new technologies. We just need to apply things that have already been created in new and innovative ways. And so a key for this is to start from the future and work backwards towards the present. When the people who developed internet technology started, one of their very first networks had 4 nodes on it. 4. And then they developed a way to do communication, and they incrementally scaled up from there. So they started small and scaled up. And most technologies work that way. The first airplane was one person, 12 seconds, 80 feet, or I guess 20 something meters. And now we have jumbo jets. So that's how technologies generally work. And I think electricity technology will work the same way. And to be clear, my focus is inside of buildings and how the building relates to the grid. I do not attempt to make claims about how the utility grid should be structured, although I have thoughts about it.
Yes. And about 60% of the energy gets consumed in buildings, electricity, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even more.
Yeah, I think in the US it's something like that. Absolutely. And as we electrify more and more of buildings, that may increase. But in any case, it's a huge amount and growing. And also, the same technologies will apply in other sectors like industry, agriculture, and also transportation. For demand flexibility, shifting and very occasionally shedding load, the goal of that is to make better use of infrastructure, mainly the infrastructure of the grid in terms of generation capacity and transmission and distribution systems, but also the infrastructure inside of buildings, and enable use of more renewable sources by better matching demand to the variable renewable supply.
Yep.
That's been well understood for a long time.
Mhm.
People who have little or no electricity today in perhaps Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, other places, off-grid and such. And hundreds of millions of people on the planet today own one electrical device, a mobile phone that they charge with a USB, just as you and I do. How do these people with very little money have access to great technology? Because we all use the same technology. And what I've come to understand is the best things in life are simple and universal. And it's the worst things that are complicated and are different in for no good reason in different places. And our communication needs in the United States are not different from the communication needs in other countries. And so it's no surprise that we can use the same technology, the internet, for communication. And electrons are all the same, and we do the same kinds of things with them. So there's no reason for electrical technology to be different in different places. If you imagine an off-grid household with a solar panel, a battery, and a few devices, the generation is variable and the people's needs are variable. How do devices know when it's best to consume power and how much to consume to properly balance supply and demand? And for people with very little technical background, these things need to be automatic, and realize that you could use price as a way to measure the availability of power at any particular time, both in relative and absolute terms, so that devices could decide when to operate and how much to operate. And this would make a household work well. And then, if you imagined several households or small businesses in a village, you could connect them together with point-to-point connections, and they could exchange electricity between them, because when the price of electricity in one was enough higher than another one, they might usefully decide to exchange power because it could be mutually beneficial. And then you could have flows of power automatically through such a network with no configuration, no central control. And then, if you imagine some number of years later, a grid connection comes along. Maybe it's a reliable grid connection, maybe it only works intermittently, it doesn't really matter. And you could then have prices from that grid connection to this network. And so you can start using the same mechanism at all scales. And of course, in wholesale energy markets all over the world, we make great use of prices. And the internet protocol is independent of scale, and it's independent of the complexity of the or topology of the network. That's why it can scale to billions of devices and over the entire globe. There's a network inside of each building. And I tend to say building rather than house because it should be
Yep.
generic to any building type, not just residential. And that could work autonomously or connected to others. But if you have a larger network, then you could exchange. And there's no limit to the size of such a network, and also no limit to the amount of power you might have on these power links. That's a result of just the particular physical layer technology, just as the amount of data we can send over an Ethernet or Wi-Fi link depends on what version of Ethernet or Wi-Fi we're using. Concepts can scale as our physical technologies expand. So in an office building, there's a lot of uses that probably would be relatively invariant to price, such as lighting or IT equipment and such. But the heating and cooling systems could vary their behavior, and you could have thermal storage to shift load. And when prices get very high, shed some load. When prices get very high, you could dim the lights. Water heating, which is, of course, not very big in an office building, can be flexible. And then, of course, we will have electrical storage in more and more places inside of individual loads. There's a company in my town that builds an induction stove with the battery. If we think about where does data storage exist on the internet, it exists everywhere. Computers have storage, network equipment has storage. We have storage all over the place. And we will have electrical storage all over the place. How much we have in different devices is an empirical thing product manufacturers will determine. But we'll make good use of storage so that we can have more loosely coupled systems rather than tightly coupled. And one thing this does is it makes microgrids inexpensive because it's just a natural property of the technology. It's not something you add on to it. It's just that any given what I call a nanogrid is inherently has the ability to be autonomous. In fact, a notebook computer is a nanogrid because it operates grid connected or off the grid. And it's a grid because it distributes power to attached USB devices. So that's an example of the seeds of this that we already have today. We just need to take these things, add a few more things like the price, and start scaling.